Toby Pearl, you have a degree in international relations and you also study law at the University of Hong Kong. So I'd be curious to ask you about that. But today, the subject of this conversation is your first book, Terror to the Wicked, America's First Trial by Jury that ended a war and helped form a nation. Toby, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I'm so delighted you're bringing this book into the world. And now I guess a lot of people like me are going to be asking you questions. My first question, Toby, is can you tell us a little bit about your background? Where do you come from? For example, I'm curious about this studying law in Hong Kong. I guess that was not online. You were you were there in person. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts, and I grew up in Boston and studied. I went to law school at Boston University, and I did go to Hong Kong for a semester to focus on studying international law. And while it was in person, living there in Hong Kong and studying, it was actually during the time of another outbreak, a smaller level pandemic, the SARS outbreak. So unfortunately, after months of wonderful classes, we did go through the process that we're seeing here today in the US and in Canada, I'm sure, of remote learning and masking and all of those challenges. Um, so it reminds me actually quite a bit of what we're going through
Oh,
now.
wow. So you had to do remote learning while you were there?
Yes, they very similar to what happened here. They shut down their university for a week, and then that week became 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then they said, "Okay, please start submitting your papers, just through the computer." We didn't have Zoom back then, but we were able to mask and drop off assignments, and so kind of similar to what we're doing today.
The rumor is that the Asian population are more adherents to the health guidelines than North American. In other words, there are not as many anti-maskers there as there are here in North America.
Well, that's interesting. I certainly, before the SARS outbreak, I took the opportunity of being in Asia to backpack around and travel. And before the SARS outbreak, I could see people wearing masks just for day-to-day use. And so perhaps that is the case where I think the idea of wearing a mask here, I already had that experience, but if I hadn't, it might have been a little unfamiliar at first.
Right. Okay. So then you come back here, and then you got this degree in international relations. And how does that translate to you being interested in the subject of this book today?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think as someone who's practiced law and someone who has served on a jury, when I came across these events that focused on a murder, a manhunt, and then one of the earliest jury trials in the country, a landmark jury trial, with my background, I was immediately transfixed and fascinated and wondered why jury trials were so important to settlers who were in found themselves in a difficult circumstance, just kind of a hand-to-mouth existence, facing very high mortality rates and starvation. And I was intrigued, why would a jury trial be so important to people in a survival situation?
And how do you stumble upon this subject? I mean, you have the whole world to be interested in about. You went back to what, the 1630s, more or less. That's a long time about. Do you stumble upon this by accident, or is this you always been a historian, is interested in history?
I think I've always been a little bit interested in history, but what happened was after I had my third child, I became more interested in genealogy and my family. So I started doing a little genealogical research, and I quickly realized I was directly related to the governor at the time in 1638 in Plymouth Colony. And I realized that he was the judge at this trial. And once I stumbled on it in that context, it didn't take long for me to become interested in the subject apart from any distant family connection.
Wow. You know, I recently, or no, just last night, I ordered the genealogy test, the 23andMe, to
Oh,
find
that's
out
fantastic.
about my ancestors. I'm from Colombia, South America, but I know
Mhm.
there's a mixture of Spaniards, French, Native Americans, Black, but I'm curious to find out more of the mix. How do you find out about your genealogy? You just dig into records, or do you take some kind of test?
Actually, I did both. During this pandemic, I did exactly what you've done. I sent away and did my DNA analysis, and I actually had some surprising results. But finding these events in 1638 was something I did years ago, about 7 years ago, before I had this DNA analysis. And what happened was once I was able to kind of map my family tree a few generations back, I realized that one of my relatives a few generations back was a descendant of the Mayflower settlers.
Right.
And the people who traveled over on the Mayflower have been very carefully documented. So once I went a few generations back, other researchers had already done all of that work for me. So it was very, I think if you ever find a relative who's connected to a historical event, someone's probably already done that genealogical research of mapping things out for you.
Wow, that's so exciting. So, about the research, you just mentioned that the Puritans, they have records of their travels and how, I guess, the early days of survivals. Were there any other challenges? I mean, this is a few hundred years back, in regards to do the research, and you describe events quite in detail. I guess for that you had to use a little bit of your imagination as well, or how much is there in actual research and how much is you helping out the story?
Sure, I did years of detailed research because there's such interest in this early colonial period, a period that just as an aside to mention, I'm focusing on this one particular jury trial, but this was also a time of terrible atrocities and um, attempted genocide and a very flawed origin story in our country. So I also wanted to shine a light on all of those profound issues that still haunt us to this day. But what I was able to do just in terms of research is use the Plymouth Colony records. So those are the early records that are still in Plymouth County. They're kept at the Plymouth County Registry of Deeds, interestingly enough. So, and they've also been digitized. So the records exist, and people were often careful letter writers. Not all of those letters and journals have been preserved, but some have. So I was able to do quite a bit of research using letters, journals, colony records. I was also able to do site research, go to those locations and go hiking around. Um, and I was also fortunate that there is an institution in Plymouth that looks back at what plants were actually in use, were cultivated almost 400 years ago. Because just because I go hiking in that same location, I know that it looked very different 400 years ago, almost 400 years ago. So I was able to both look with my eyes and do that research as an overlay to make sure I was getting it right. And I was also, last thing I'll mention, able to look at probate records. People left very careful wills, and I was able to see very detailed information. What books were they reading? What kind of textiles did they have? What kind of socks were they wearing? What kind of kettle did they use to cook? What was the name of their cow? All of that information was recorded in great detail in their wills. So I was able to glean quite a bit that way too.
Wow, that's interesting. How different was the English of that period to today's English? Was there difficult to understand, or you just, because you've been reading that period, was it easy for you to understand everything that they were writing in those letters?
That's a great question. at first, the penmanship looked like a different language to me, and it took a very long time to um, become familiar with how to read it. And I would take photographs and then zoom into the letters and kind of decipher them and translate it and then transcribe it, just typing it up in separate documents on my computer so I could see what was written. So it took a very long time. And there was a point early on where I thought um, the English language in this period just wasn't very well, wasn't very uniform. Spelling, penmanship, it was all over the place. But then I looked at the king's calendar rolls, and these were a scribe for the king who, or a scribe who would write letters for the king. And I saw that the penmanship, the literacy, the written word was perfect and very well done. So I think there was a huge range in terms of literacy at the time.
Wow. Okay. So can you tell us about the plight of the Puritan settlers? I mean, why did they feel the need to get out of England, or what is it that either were they running away from, or they were trying to find here in the colonies?
Sure, that's a great question. Indeed, they were tortured and imprisoned in England for their religious beliefs. So they were very much trying to find somewhere that they could practice their religion in peace and have liberty to do that. So the atrocities they faced in England were barbaric, everything from facial branding to being thrown in a dungeon. With very little due process and just deplorable conditions. So they very much were a group of people looking for religious freedom. With that said, kind of this very dark irony that I try and shine a light on in the book is that in as much as they wanted these liberties for themselves, when they came to what is present day called New England, they did not provide those same liberties and protections and autonomy to the indigenous peoples who were there, who assisted them in their survival in those early years. So there was, in as much as they wanted liberty, they undermined it as they chipped away at that concept for others.
Wow, the oppressed became the oppressor, in other words.
Very much so, without self-awareness of that whatsoever. So very much the case.
So I read from your book that even the trajectory itself from England to the new colonies was difficult. Can you describe how difficult, or what was the survival rate of people arriving to the new land?
Sure. Of the Mayflower settlers, there were 100 plus people, men, women, and many children, and half died the first winter. Um, the majority, except for 2 people, got very, very sick that first winter. Like I said, half died. The 2 out of the whole group who did not fall ill cared for the remaining 50 survivors. But it was mostly children who came through unscathed. So that remaining small group was a large percentage of children and these 2 people who, for whatever reason, didn't get sick at all, but half died, and very gruesome conditions. It was a very difficult winter. You're in Canada. You can imagine if someone was not prepared for how to quickly build shelter and sustain themselves in those cold conditions, you would die very quickly, which is
Yeah,
fine.
you mentioned that when I first came to Canada, I had no idea of what cold really meant. I thought it was
Uh,
like my room, air conditioned room in Colombia. So I just bought
uh,
some kind of fancy looking jacket. I thought I would be fashionable. And when I get here, I don't know in Fahrenheit, but it was like minus 20 Celsius.
oh.
And I almost
The
died.
climate's brutal. It's dangerous. It certainly is.
Okay, so can you tell us? So these strange new white people arrived to the new world. Can you tell us what was the reaction of the Native American? Did they welcome them? Did they refuse them? Did they attack them? How did they react when they saw these strange people coming out of a boat?
Sure. Ultimately, once the Plymouth colony settlers began to settle and decamp and try and set up shelter, they encountered the Wampanoag, who were incredibly generous. Massasoit was the leader of the Wampanoag at that time, and he offered tremendous, generous assistance, helping from everything, supplies to indigenous peoples, taught the settlers how to fertilize the ground with fish that were caught in the local water so that corn could actually grow in the difficult soil. So it was a very kind of basic hand-to-mouth existence that they could not have even begun to comprehend and succeed at without the help of the indigenous people.
Wow. And of course, as immigrant from England, they have this concept of property law and territory and how land is divided among its citizens, which was a strange concept for the Native American. Can you tell us about this tension of, okay, this is my house, this is my territory, and you are not allowed to come even close to it. Otherwise, I guess I'll shoot you.
Right. These are concepts that were absolutely foreign, and um, very much you have the concept of these settlers being settler colonists. So these were not people who, even though they were seeking freedom for their religious beliefs, they were not people who came merely to settle, live in a home, and be autonomous next to other autonomous people. They wanted to create a hierarchy in which their authority was universal over those around them. And right, you can see exactly the terrible implications of that mindset to any indigenous people they encountered. So even if there were initially signs of friendship, goodwill, peace, if someone has the mindset of subsuming the culture that's already in existence, there's no way that it can ever truly be an act of peace. Certainly there could have been a situation of co-autonomous living, and that's not what happened. And you're exactly right to pinpoint this desire for land as underlying everything that the settlers did. They wanted to own the land. They certainly wrote deeds. They felt that they were being very fair, but as I alluded to, the whole premise of what they were doing was unfair.
Yeah, I hear that the concept of land ownership is changing around the world. Like you can possess, I mean, in the wild, you can possess this piece of land, but you cannot deny access to, let's say, people traveling or hiking or whatever. Is I see a lot of changes, especially in Europe, and I don't know how much in the States, but it's funny how the cycle is coming around to, okay, this is my land, I can exploit it. But if you feel like, I don't know, just hiking on it or do bird watching, you should be allowed to do that.
Right. I absolutely agree, and I find it fascinating. I think America in particular has a very fixed, perhaps toxic relationship to land. And I've spent time living in Costa Rica, which is a beautiful country. And my understanding is that in Costa Rica, regardless of ownership of land adjacent, no one is allowed to own any coastal land. Those water areas where water access along the coastline can be reached is open to anyone who would like to visit the beach, to see the wildlife. No one can prevent that. And it is interesting to see how other countries handle that. And I think it does shed light on the thinking about natural resources and how people interact with nature and everything good that comes from people interacting with nature and protecting it and sharing it.
Right. Okay. So without giving away the book, how does this trial happens? What is the series of events that force the colonies to have this trial? And I guess it's a public trial in order to show everyone that this is a law-abiding country or a colony.
Sure. So 4 indentured servants escaped, and indentured servants at this time were mostly men who came over, often from England, who agreed to work for a number of years, often 7 years, for room and board and passage over. So these were a group of 4 men who had entered into this contract to become indentured servants. Arthur Peach was kind of the ringleader of this group. And these 4 men were disenchanted with their circumstances, with the amount of work they were doing, without being paid, without access to things that they wanted. So these 4 men escaped during the night from Plymouth Colony and set off on footpaths that were indigenous footpaths that led through the woods to go from one area to another. These 4 men, Arthur Peach leading the way, headed south and made it as far as the outskirts of present-day Providence, Rhode Island. And they were not doing well. They did not have a lot of resources or skills for hiking through the woods, or supplies, provisions with them. So they were lost, hungry, tired. They had kind of camped by the side of one of these footpaths through the woods, and they spot a man who is called Penawanyanquis, who is an indigenous trader of the Nipmuc tribe, a young man who was headed toward Plymouth Colony's trading outpost to trade beaver pelts, which were in very high demand at the time, for wampum, which were a type of shell that was polished and used as the currency of the day, both by settlers and indigenous people. It was marketed as the currency by treaty. And so they spot Penawanyanquis, and there's no interaction. But that night, we have in the archival records, Arthur Peach saying to his companions, I'm going to kill him and take what he has from him when he comes back. And indeed, when Penawanyanquis, after he's traded the beaver fur and he has this huge satchel of wampum, Arthur Peach leads the way and attacks him on this desolate footpath. And what no one could have predicted is that Penawanyanquis survives long enough to identify his killers in a deathbed declaration to none other than the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams. And then Penawanyanquis dies shortly after, but it falls on Roger Williams's shoulders to find the murderers.
So you say that this trial, the first trial by jury, ended the war and helped form the nation. So how in particular the trial helped form the nation?
That's a great question. One thing I should note that in 1638, the Pequot War was ongoing. And that was a war fought largely between Mass Bay Colony settlers, present-day Boston, Massachusetts, against the Pequot tribe. So this would be west of Plymouth Colony. So those battles were unfolding between 1636 and 1638. And when Penawanyanquis was murdered, it was a tinderbox of a situation, and it was exactly this type of murder that could draw in other indigenous tribes. So right when settlers and perhaps other indigenous communities had been hoping for the war to subside, this murder potentially ignited it. And that's what we have in the historical record, is indigenous and settlers alike worried about the violence and expansion of battles because of this murder.
Did the Native American had a concept of what the Europeans call justice, or having a jury by trial? Or how do you have any idea how the natives settled their arguments, or in this case, a murder or any injustice? Did they do something similar to a trial?
Sure. Indigenous communities, my understanding is varied in having their own completely autonomous, well-developed, strong systems of dispensing justice, of having their own forms of leadership and republic and statehood within themselves, and meting out justice completely in their own autonomous way, of course. Because this happened with settlers as the accused killers, there was an idea, certainly on the part of the settlers, that they would handle the justice. And again, as we talked about earlier, with settler colonists wanting to supersede other structures that were already in place. This was yet another case. I think in an ideal world, there may have been, of course, a more open discussion about who should be the authority to deal out justice in this situation. But that was not the case in this time with the settlers. But nonetheless, there was a demand for a jury trial, and it fell on Plymouth Colony to host the jury trial. And it was a question mark at that time whether or not these early settlers were capable of putting on a jury trial successfully. So that became a question, and that also played into what was the nation that they were building. And was it going to be a nation of democratic structures with a free and open, fair judicial system? And it was a question mark. And the war was a question mark. And the origin story that we've been handed down, flawed as it is, would have looked very different if the war had erupted further instead of being quelled. Because after the jury trial, about 2 weeks later, the Pequot War ended by treaty resolution.
Well, okay, so Toby, we will let the listeners find out what happened at the trial whenever they buy and read the book. Can you tell us one more time what's the title of the book and where can listeners find you or follow you?
Oh, thank you. The book is called Terror to the Wicked, and I have a website, Tobey Pearl. It's Tobey Pearl. I always encourage people to check out their local independent bookstore, and I hope you might find it there.
Toby, I think you're an amazing storyteller, and I very much enjoy the book. So thank you so much for sharing it with our audience.
Thank you so very much. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you.